Welcome to another Cyber Lab. In this introduction to Amazon S3 enumeration, we're going to learn a little bit more about the Amazon S3 service and how to get started enumerating that service. If you're not already familiar with S3, it stands for Simple Storage Service, and it's a cloud storage service that's provided by Amazon Web Services. It basically allows you to store and retrieve data of all kinds. Talking about files, documents, images, videos, really just about anything you can think of. And because it's used by individuals and small to medium to large organizations for all sorts of data, including sensitive data, it can be a very juicy target for attackers. You can just do a quick Google search for Amazon S3 data leak, and you will see what I mean. There's going to be a ton. It's been one of those cloud services that has had the most publicized data leaks, but every single one of those leaks have been a direct result of customer misconfiguration. That's why it's important to learn how to enumerate Amazon S3, because it's a step in the right direction of learning how to find some of these misconfigurations for your employer or for your client. So let's go ahead and get started now that we have some background information. If you haven't yet, go ahead and launch this free Cyber Lab on cyber.com, and you'll get back an access key ID as well as a secret access key, which we're going to use to configure our AWS CLI. If you don't already have your CLI installed by now, then go ahead and do that and then come back. But if you've been following our courses, then you probably already have the AWS CLI configured, or installed, I should say. And so now we're ready to configure with AWS configure as our command. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll paste in, nope, that is not what I meant to paste in. We'll do AWS configure like this. And if you want to, you can always pass in a profile name, which I will do, and I'll just name mine lab. So going back to our browser window, we'll grab this first value here, paste that in as the access key ID. Then the second one for secret access key, make sure you're using US East 1. And then I like JSON, but you don't have to use that. You can just leave it to the default and press enter. With our CLI configured, we can pass in the who am I of AWS, which is get caller identity, and I'll pass in my profile name of lab. So I'll get back this basic information, just telling us that, hey, you are a user or you're authenticated as a user, and my username is Derek. Your ARN or username may look a little bit different. It's different for each and every lab. If that's the case, it doesn't matter. It won't make any difference whatsoever. This is just a username, so it doesn't really matter what you see there. Then going back to our instructions, we can get a little bit more information about what to do to get started with AWS or Amazon S3 enumeration. The first thing I would like to do if you were to get access to this type of lab is just to get a lay of the land, to figure out what your user has access to now that we know that we're authenticated as a user. So to get started, we can pass in this command right here, which is list user policies. And I promise we'll get to the actual S3 stuff in just a moment. So we'll pass in, and I don't want to pass in the whole ARN actually, I just want to pass in the username, and I'll do profile lab. And this will show us that the policy name is this long string right here. And so using that, we can now retrieve the user policy. So I'll copy this other command that's a little bit different. Now we're talking about get user policy instead of list user policy. I still need to pass in my username, so I'll do that. But now I also need to pass in my policy name. So we'll do that next. I'll do space, and then I'll copy and paste this policy name and pass in my profile of lab. Now we retrieve the policy that's associated with this IAM user. We can see that we have some IAM access here. You can ignore that. That's just so that you have access to do what we're doing right now, like listing policies and such and things like that. But we also have access to actions like Amazon S3 list bucket or get bucket policy. Separately, we also have get object. And then finally, we have list all my buckets as well as get bucket location. So why are these separated like this? Why not just have all actions under one group and then have all the resources listed out or kept the same? This is an interesting quirk about Amazon S3 to keep in mind as you're doing enumeration and as you're looking at IAM policies, because when you're looking at list bucket or get bucket policy, these are bucket level operations. Since we're doing bucket level operations, we have to use a bucket ARN. So this is one example of a bucket ARN, and this is another example of a bucket ARN. So this is telling us we have the ability to list two separate buckets. We have data bucket 1 and data bucket 2. But then if we look at S3 get object over here, we'll see that it's almost the same ARN, but not quite the same. We have a / and asterisk. This is not just added just for aesthetic purposes. This is how it has to work because getObject is an object level operation. So in Amazon S3, I can't just say I want to allow getObject on the bucket. I have to say I want to allow getObject actions on the objects within that bucket. And you do that by adding in the / and then asterisk. So a good way to remember that is you have a directory, right? This is your directory name right here, but getObject is for objects within that directory. So / everything in that directory. That's just kind of how I remember it. I don't know if that makes sense when I say it out loud, but that's typically my thought process. So that's a little bit of a quirk when it comes to Amazon S3 that I need you to remember. And so that's another reason I wanted to include this in this lab and not just go straight into the S3 commands, because I think that's important to know about when you're learning about AWS. But let's go back to our instructions, kind of explain that a little bit more here in text. Hopefully, if that didn't click, try to read through that. Might make more sense. But now let's actually run some S3 commands, because again, S3 is Amazon's oldest service, so they do things a little bit different. I think they've learned since then and they've kept it a little bit simpler, but the S3 CLI and API is pretty quirky. So let's walk through it. There are actually 4 different separate service names that give us access to slightly different functionality when we're looking at the CLI. So I've opened the first 2 because we're going to ignore these other 2. They're not really relevant to this lab. We'll just look at these first 2 links. So as you can see, we're in the AWS CLI command reference. There's a command reference for just S3, and then there's another one for S3 API. These provide access to slightly different types of commands that you can pass in. Some of them might have a little bit of overlap, but in general, this first one here typically only provides you with high-level commands that we can execute against the S3 service. Like, for example, you can do things like copy, move, remove on single local files, S3 object operations, directory and S3 prefix operations, stuff like that. Versus if we go to the S3 API, this is what we're more used to nowadays. This is kind of how other service command references will look. You have the name of the command and it's listed out in a list like this. You can look at what you're looking for and click through and get more information. So don't ignore this one. This one still has some good stuff in it. Go ahead and study this on your own free time if you're interested. But for the most part, we're going to be using this one in this lab. As an example of that, if we go back to our guide here, we can get started by doing things like S3 API list buckets, and then we'll list objects as well. And we'll find list buckets in here. So if we click on that, it will tell us exactly how to run this operation, which everything else is optional when we're looking at arguments. So we don't really have to pass in any arguments. So let's go ahead and run that command. Let me go ahead and clear screen. We'll do S3 API and then list buckets, profile lab, and we'll see our data bucket 1 and data bucket 2, just like we saw in the IAM policy. Now to retrieve objects, we can go back over here and we could do, for example, list objects, but again, a weird quirk. We have 2 list objects. We have this one here, and then we have a V2. If you want to take a look at that one, go for it. This is the latest version. This one gives you better information typically, so that's the one we're going to use. So if I scroll down a little bit, we'll see list objects, and then passing in the bucket name. So we'll do AWS S3 API, list objects 2, V2, and then we'll do bucket. So we'll do it for this first bucket to start, profile of lab. Now we see that there's an object within this bucket. It's called object.txt, and we get other information like we can see the last modified, an e tag, which is just a tag value. We have the size of this object and the storage class. There's different storage classes in Amazon S3 and stuff like that. We can also download this object if we want to. So we could do S3 API, get object. And again, this is in the reference material if you want to look at that. And then I'll copy and paste this bucket name. And we'll do key, and we'll pass in the key of object.txt. And then I will download this in my documents /recordings /object.txt and profile of lab. So that will download it locally. I could show you, but go ahead and take a look if you want to. This file will now be in my documents recordings.txt. and we can see it right here, object.txt. So it's successfully downloaded because we have permission to do this to our local computer, and this is how you can transfer files. But if we were to try and do something similar, so if we were to try and list objects on the second bucket, if we're going to do list buckets just to relist them, and then if we're going to try to retrieve objects from that second bucket, so let's say this guy over here, we will get access denied, even though if you remember from just a few commands ago, our IAM policy gave us access to this bucket as well. So what's going on? Well, this is happening because in addition to this user's identity-based policy that grants access, we also have resource-based policies in AWS. And resource-based policies, when it comes to S3 specifically, can be set per bucket. So we can have bucket policies. As an example, I could type in AWS S3 API, get bucket policy, and then we'll pass in the first bucket name since we have access to that one, it appears, and we'll do profile of lab. We will get back the bucket policy. So this is an extra layer of defense. We have to have access at the identity policy, and we have to have access at the resource policy. If any one of those has a deny, an explicit deny, it overrides all allows in the chain of command. So because, and we could check this with the second bucket if we want to, but I'm going to tell you ahead of time, because this bucket policy on the second bucket prevents us from accessing it, we cannot access information about the bucket, nor can we access information about objects within that bucket, which most likely tells us as a pen tester or researcher or whatever that we probably have a bucket policy that is restricting access. So this is defense in depth. This is using all the tools at our disposal to restrict access and again, add multiple different types of policies that can deny access. That way, if we misconfigure on one end, say at the identity policy, then we still have a failsafe at the bucket policy level. Hopefully that makes sense. If you need any additional information, let me know in the comments below. But that's it. We've now listed buckets and objects in an AWS account, and we've even downloaded one of the objects. And finally, we learned about identity-based policies versus resource-based policies, and we saw it in action when it denied our access. You're now ready to move on to the next lab. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.